Part 7. Important Information. Previously on Ghost Creek. Penny Thompson returned to her family farm after her father died suddenly. Penny is haunted by memories of her mother, who died of cancer when Penny was a teenager, and the tragic death of her brother Eric in a car accident. Penny was resigned to the plan of selling the farm to the town of Westfield, which had made a deal with Penny's father to keep the land undeveloped in exchange for a monthly payment. But before Penny could sign the deal and go back to the city, she and her old high school sweetheart, Chuck Foreman, now a sheriff's deputy, discovered a body buried in the embankment of the creek out by the cow pasture. Based on letters to Eric and Eric's suicide note, Penny and Chuck concluded that the body had been Oliver Epstein, who was Eric's lover. After Penny found her father's missing hammer, which was likely the murder weapon, Penny confided in Chuck that her father used to beat Eric and never accepted that Eric was gay. Penny and Chuck concluded that Penny's father probably killed Oliver. Meanwhile, Penny struggled with the decision to sell the farm, knowing that it would likely be turned into a development. She returned to Westfield expecting to sell quickly, take the money, and leave forever. Now, after reconnecting with Chuck and working to restore the old tractor, Penny has had second thoughts. Part 7. Important Information. When the high school opened for classes in August, Penny lost her work crew. The after-school driver safety students had other after-school commitments. Duke, however, was her constant companion. Penny had always loved the now-aging lab, but with the rest of the family all gone, Duke's presence was more of a comfort than she could have imagined. In the north field, the pumpkin plants were sprouting, and the first flowers emerged on the leftover plants from the prior year. The high school kids had carved some pathways through the still stunted cornfield to form the beginnings of a maze, but didn't finish before their summer break ended. Penny put down fertilizer and ran water down the rows of juvenile pumpkin plants whenever there were too many days between rains. The days were less stiflingly hot, although autumn was still a distant concept. Penny took long walks around the farm, Duke at her side, lost in thoughts of her brother Eric and her mother. She even went out to the creek and walked along the bank, the water having receded back to the gentle flow that she played in as a girl. The trauma of nearly drowning no longer haunted her dreams. Penny's efforts to revitalize the old tractor hit another obstacle. The new starter was installed, but it turned out the fuel pump was shot. On the first Saturday of September, Penny walked down to the end of the long gravel drive to retrieve the mail. When she saw the white cardboard box inside, she squealed, causing Duke to bark excitedly. After weeks of trolling the internet at the Westfield Library, which had decent Wi-Fi, she found a farmer who agreed to send her a fuel pump, cannibalized from another old tractor. She ran to the barn with her prize and immediately went to work. It was stained with years of engine grit and pitted from being bounced around on some distant farm. To Penny, though, it was a thing of beauty. An hour later, she was up to her elbows in the engine when Chuck's voice called out from the half-open door. Duke didn't bark, but bounded to Chuck, happy for someone to pay some attention and scratch him behind the ears. "How's the sexiest tractor mechanic in the Midwest?" Penny wiped her arms on a white rag and grinned. "I've got the new fuel pump installed." "Want to start her up?" Chuck asked as Penny climbed into the cab. "I haven't seen you this excited about anything since you got back. You think you really have it?" Penny turned the key. The grinding starter gave way to a sputter as diesel fuel entered the carburetor and exploded at a spark from the plug. Another sputter, then another, faster than the last, followed by a pop from the exhaust pipe. A puff of blue-gray smoke, the scent of oil, and then the regular rumble of a running engine filled the barn. Duke barked, and Penny whooped and threw both arms into the air. Then the engine stopped, and she hopped down from the spring-loaded seat. "Why'd you turn her off?"
"Don't want too much excitement all at once. Plus, I don't want us to die from carbon monoxide poisoning here in this stuffy barn."
"Want to take her outside, sweetheart?" Chuck offered.
"Not yet. We need to grease those axles first. I'm thinking we should tow it outside before trying to get it moving. Maybe tomorrow."
Penny slid next to Chuck and encircled his waist with her dirty arms.
"And did you call me sweetheart?"
Chuck blushed. "Well, sorry about that. It's how I still think of you. You know that, right?" She rested her head against his chest, feeling his heart racing.
"I figured you weren't coming out here every day just because of my wonderful cooking."
Penny teased and craned her neck backwards so she could look into his face. She felt pressure rising through her neck into her face. Her own pulse pounded in her ear.
"You remember the weekend before graduation? Here in the barn?"
"I think about it all the time. We nearly lost our virginity." Penny's eyes were even with Chuck's neck. A bead of sweat slowly traced a path around his Adam's apple, dodging a curly brown hair. She pushed back a few inches, raising her eyes.
"We probably would have made a mess of it back then, huh?"
Chuck laughed and pulled her tight against his chest. She felt her breasts compress and noticed Chuck's obvious interest against her hip. "It would have been special, but I'm sure we would have been awkward and clumsy."
"I wish you had been my first."
Penny gently rubbed her open palm over Chuck's pectoral muscle, feeling the peak of a nipple beneath his shirt.
"You would have been gentle."
Chuck lifted her chin with a finger and leaned down toward her. "I can still be gentle." His lips brushed hers, sending a shiver up her spine. She rose up onto her tiptoes, aching for a real kiss. Chuck didn't keep her waiting. Time stood still as they explored each other's mouths and tongues, arms squeezing and massaging the other's back. Duke curled up under the tractor without a perceptible sound. Each new kiss surprised Penny, some hungry and firm, some soft, and an occasional playful peck. Without warning, Chuck swept her legs from under her, lifting Penny into his arms. He held her at eye level and said breathlessly, "I'm all for recreating that night here in the barn, but we might be more comfortable in the house, on a mattress." He kissed her again, as if not wanting the heat of the moment to wane while Penny thought about the venue for lovemaking. Without disengaging lips, she nodded and mumbled,
"Uh-huh,"
running her fingers through the hair above his neck. Chuck kept kissing her while striding quickly toward the barn door. A sweaty half-hour later, Penny's head rested on Chuck's chest, their naked bodies covered by a thin cotton sheet. Penny's bed was a single. Her childhood bedroom had never been upgraded. But using her parents' bed was out of the question. Too many ghosts there. Since their bodies were mostly on top of each other, the bed's width proved no obstacle to some athletic sex. Chuck was indeed gentle. When she asked him to, however, he was happy to pick up the pace. Now they dozed in the afternoon heat. In her half-awake bliss, Penny considered whether they should stay in bed until morning, but Duke's sharp bark of alert snapped her out of the haze. Chuck jumped out of bed and dashed to the window, peering toward the driveway. 2 cars clogged the narrow space. One was a sheriff's SUV. More unsettling was the sight of his boss, Sheriff Jack Baskins, standing in the sun, removing his sunglasses and smoky bear hat and fanning his face.
"Who's there?"
Penny asked as she recovered her underwear and opened a drawer of clean shirts. "It's Sheriff Baskins, along with Mayor Allman and a few other folks."
"What the hell?"
Penny slid into her jeans. She suppressed a smirk, watching Chuck search the room for his clothes. She envisioned him as an 18-year-old, doing the same after hearing her father's car driving up while they were engaged in her bedroom. Amid Duke's persistent barking, Chuck and Penny hustled down the stairs and out the kitchen door into the bright sunlight. Along with the sheriff and the mayor, Chuck recognized the town's lawyer, Rupert James, and Connie Vogt, the chairperson of the town council. Chuck approached his boss with a puzzled expression. "What brings you all out here on a Saturday?" Mayor Ullman answered the question, although Chuck hadn't asked him. "I'm afraid there's some potentially unpleasant business that couldn't wait until Monday." He took a few steps toward Penny, prompting a growl from Duke. Ullman stopped, holding up his open palms toward the dog. "Miss Thompson, the investigation into the boy they dug up on your farm is now officially a homicide. The boy was murdered. Sheriff Baskins is here because two of the suspects are Gary and Eric Thompson."
Suspects?
Penny looked at Chuck.
How can somebody who's dead be a suspect?
The mayor cleared his throat, as if preparing to address a crowd. "Normally they would not be, since they could not be prosecuted. However, in this case it could be significant because of the impact on the lease." Penny scanned the group, searching for some sign that anyone was as confused as she was. Only Chuck returned her gaze.
"What do you mean? What impact?"
"I thought you knew," Sheriff Baskins replied, as if addressing a chemistry student who didn't know the atoms in a water molecule. "The agreement your father had with the town gave him the right to live here and work the farm, as long as he maintained the property for benefit to the public. The arrangement is voided if a family member engaged in criminal activity on the land." Penny stared blankly.
What? What does that even mean?"
The lawyer stepped forward to answer in a deep, professorial voice. "It means the leaseholder could not grow illegal drugs, or use the farm as a depot to sell drugs or illegal weapons, or any other kind of criminal activity. But under the terms of the document, committing a murder would also qualify as criminal activity." Chuck had moved close to Penny while the lawyer spoke. He slid an arm around her waist. "So, suppose an investigation found that someone from the family committed a crime on the property. What would happen? What's the effect on the open space agreement?" "The agreement would be breached," the lawyer said, as if that were a self-evident response. When his comment garnered more blank stares, he elaborated. "In the case of a breach by the leaseholder, the town has the right to terminate the agreement and exercise its option to acquire the property for the agreed-upon price, less a 25% penalty." Penny's right hand found Chuck's at her hip. She squeezed tight. His return squeeze confirmed his loyalty, but a lump formed in her gut.
"Doesn't that put the town in a conflicted position? I mean, the town is investigating the case, but the town has a vested interest in a particular outcome, right?"
The mayor harumphed. "I should say not, young lady." "It don't matter," Sheriff Baskins interrupted. "I work for the county, not the town. I can assure you that my investigation will be completely impartial. Right, Deputy Foreman?" "Of course." Chuck had no choice but to agree. He knew the sheriff was a close friend of Mayor Ullman. He also knew that the town of Westfield provided most of the funding for the county's law enforcement budget. But he worked for the sheriff, and he was also a county employee. Accusing his boss of lying would have been a poor career move. "Well, that settles it then." Sheriff Baskins turned back to his SUV, where he resumed his posture of leaning against the grill. Penny looked from face to face, hoping for some sympathy, but found none.
"You're telling me that if the sheriff decides that one of my dead relatives killed that boy, then I have to sell the farm and the house for $300,000? Is that it?" $337,500.
Connie Vogt, the councilwoman, piped up, obviously having memorized the math. Penny turned to Chuck and whispered,
Can they do that?
I don't know, but I'm betting they sure think they can, or they wouldn't be here. He turned to his boss. What evidence points to Farmer Thompson, or his son? I can't talk about that in front of a witness. Witness?
You mean me?
Penny disengaged from Chuck's hand and dropped her arms to the side.
I wasn't living here. How am I a witness?
Like I said, Baskins smiled, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses. I really can't talk about that right now. I'm going to ask you to come down to the office on Monday morning so I can take your statement. In the meantime, I'm declaring the whole farm to be a crime scene, and I'm going to have to ask you to vacate until we complete the investigation.
You must be joking.
The serenity she felt lying in bed with Chuck a few minutes before was now a distant memory. I'm afraid not. I'll help Miss Thompson get some things together. Chuck moved in front of Penny as if shielding her. What do you need me to do, Sheriff? Baskins removed his glasses. You won't be working the case, Foreman. You're conflicted. An hour later, her day turned upside down. Penny held open the rear hatch of Chuck's SUV and coaxed Duke into the back. She would stay at Chuck's place, but had no idea how long the sheriff's investigation would close down the farm.
Who's going to water the pumpkins if it doesn't rain?
She reached back to make sure Duke was lying down. You're worried about the pumpkins? Does that mean you plan to be here for pickin' season?
Maybe.
Penny put her hand on Chuck's thigh. As they pulled onto the paved road, a deputy exited his vehicle, holding a large roll of yellow crime scene ribbon. As the farm receded from the rearview mirror, Chuck asked, When they search the workbench in the barn, are they going to find anything?
They'll find tools.
Will those tools include any hammers?
No,
Penny said firmly.
No chance.